Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. Fresno, California. Tuesday night, December 7th, 2021, around closing time. Within minutes of leaving a downtown art show, Missy Hernandez, 30, goes silent. Plans missed. Messages unread. Later that night, a call to 911 for a welfare check turns uncertainty into a crime inquiry that will grow far beyond one address, according to police reports and contemporaneous media. We start with the clock. It doesn't argue. Deck 7 evening, Missy is seen departing the art event with her boyfriend. Friends expect follow-ups about vending dates and pickup times. None arrive. Within minutes to hours, her normal online activity flatlines. That abrupt silence, no posts, no replies, no transactions, is logged as negative evidence of voluntary disappearance, a quiet anomaly that elevates risk. Late night into early Deci 8. Friends, unable to reach her, request a welfare check. Deputies go to Missy's residence in Fresno. The home is calm from the street, lights, a parked vehicle, nothing obvious. Inside, officers document what's there and, just as critically, what isn't. No sign of routine contact from Missy and no immediate indicators of forced entry disclosed publicly. A man at the location is identified and, based on an October 2021 domestic violence case involving Missy, is arrested on that earlier matter and booked without bail. The missing person work continues on a separate track. Attribution remains neutral at this stage. The language used by officials is cautious and procedural. Deca 8, daytime. Detectives begin parallel tasks, confirm the last verified sighting at the downtown venue, pull any available security timestamps nearby, and secure the residence for full forensic processing. The first moves are administrative but critical: evidence logs, scene control, and contact lists. They issue tip lines and push for anyone who saw Missy after the art show to come forward. In towns like Fresno, disappearances aren't just cases on paper. They interrupt the weeknight rhythm. Deck 11. The sheriff's office labels the case suspicious, a formal shift that unlocks broader resources, expanded searches, lab prioritization, and digital tasking. The data starts to stack: when Missy was last seen, who she left with, and how quickly her phone and social feeds went dark. One investigator would later put it simply: the alignment of those factors was too clean. Sometimes that's the problem. Early January 2022. As results return and leads converge, prosecutors prepare filings while search teams extend their reach beyond the city grid. Jan 13, 2022, authorities announce a murder charge. Jan 16, 2022, recovery divers locate Missy Hernandez in the California aqueduct near Siskiyou Ave and WW, Doris Ave, Huron. That discovery is recorded once here to complete the timeline. Details of intake move to the next phase. This first chapter locks the spine. Last seen Deck 7, welfare check Deck 8, suspicious designation Deck 11, charge John 13, recovery John 16. From here, we separate custody of remains from the home as primary scene. Two different locations, two different purposes. The scene shifts from a Fresno residence to a controlled room with stainless steel counters and numbered seals. This is where timelines stop and custody begins. According to police reports and contemporaneous media, the sheriff coroner receives Missy Hernandez under documented seal on January 16, 2022. From that moment, the body is treated as a standalone scene. Every movement is logged. Every container is initialed. Every transfer is witnessed. No dramatics, just chain of custody that has to survive court. Intake starts with identification protocols. Technicians photograph the decedent, document clothing and property, and assign a case number that will follow every swab, slide, and tube. Personal effects are itemized, bagged, and sealed with unique numbers. Those seals are recorded on an evidence receipt. If a bag is opened later for testing, a new seal replaces the old one, and the log reflects who, when, and why. It's mundane only until a defense attorney challenges a gap months down the line. A preliminary external exam records height, approximate weight, distinguishing marks, and the condition of hands, nails, and hair. Technicians collect trace material from beneath fingernails and from hair combings. Clothing is dried if needed, then packaged in breathable paper to preserve potential DNA and fiber integrity. Any adhesive lifts for microtrace are labeled as preliminary until a lab report converts them to confirmed. The language matters, so does the order. Secure first, test next, interpret last. Biological sampling follows a fixed pattern. Reference samples, blood or alternative, are taken for later comparison. Swabs are collected from predefined anatomical sites. Each swab pair rides in its own envelope with a duplicate label, one for screening, the mate held in reserve. Toxicology tubes, typically fluoride oxalate and clot tubes, are filled, capped, and placed into a locked refrigerator with a temperature log. A courier signature records their exit to the tox lab. Another signature confirms arrival. Break the chain and you break the value. At this stage, mechanism and cause are not publicly disclosed. That is standard. The medical examiner documents injuries, post-mortem changes, and any features relevant to a time of death window. Photographs run wide to close, full body, regional, then macro. Measurements are written directly onto photo scales or in the frame to prevent mislabeling later. Where a wound is suspected, a pathologist may note trajectories or pattern features, but those notations stay in the case file until admissibility is resolved in court. The morgue team also thinks forward. They request comparison points for any scene DNA previously reported by detectives as indicating a violent act at the residence. That means preserving enough reference material to allow blind retesting and second opinion analysis if the court orders it. Duplicate aliquots are split, at least one remains in agency custody. Bridge samples, items that could link body, residence, and a transport path, are logged in a way that lets a jury see the pivot without confusion. Digital paperwork is its own evidence. The tracking system timestamps each action. When custody started, when the external exam concluded, when the pathologist began internal examination, when tox left the building. Those timestamps have a second purpose. They verify that testing occurred within validated windows. Defense experts look for temperature dips, uncalibrated scales, or mismatched lot numbers on kits. A clean record closes those doors. This room also sets the tone for the rest of the case. Families want answers, investigators want proof that holds. The morgue cannot supply motive, but it can supply facts that resist spin. Is there foreign DNA? Are there fibers inconsistent with the decedent's clothing? Do insect or water-related findings help narrow the post-mortem interval? In towns like Fresno, murders aren't just crimes. They interrupt the weeknight rhythm. But in this room, rhythm is replaced by procedure. The data aligned cleanly. Sometimes that's the problem, and sometimes it's the strength. By the end of intake, the case has 3 clean lanes. Biological samples sealed and queued, trace preserved for microscopy and DNA, and toxicology secured for screening with confirmatory testing to follow. No retelling of discovery is needed. The only story that matters here is whether the evidence can speak the same way in 6 months as it does today. If you were on a jury, which record would you want to see first from the morgue? Seal logs, toxicology chain of custody, or the external exam photo index? By the time the warrant team steps back into the Fresno residence, priorities are clear. Preserve what's there, document what isn't, and separate rumor from record. The home is treated as the primary scene. According to officials, laboratory testing later identified DNA indicating a violent act inside this address. That single sentence drives how the room is read. Technicians move in measured arcs. Photograph first, collect second, interpret last. Entry points come before anything else. Door jambs and window latches are photographed with scale and raked light to capture tool impressions, if any exist. Nothing publicly disclosed suggests forced entry, so investigators lean on quiet indicators, misaligned dust outlines, displaced rugs, wiped sections on a high-touch surface. Those are logged without drama. They don't prove a confrontation. They tell technicians where to swab. Collection follows a grid. High probability zones around handles, switches, edges of furniture, and any surface with disturbance patterns are swabbed in duplicate. Each pair is split, one for screening, one reserved, labels mirrored so a second lab can retest later if the court orders it. Items that could transfer trace, lightweight fabrics, a towel, a blanket, are dried if necessary and packaged in paper to protect microscopic fibers and DNA. Until a report returns, everything is tagged working evidence. When the lab confirms an origin or mixture profile, the tag changes to confirmed in the log. The language matters. A jury will see that delta, latent print processing, runs in parallel. Smooth surfaces get cyanoacrylate fuming or magnetic powder, depending on material. Usable ridge detail is photographed and lifted. Low-quality marks are still preserved because a partial can rule out or include later when combined with other data. Footwear impressions, if present, are cast or photographed with oblique light. Investigators avoid overpromising. A partial outsole doesn't convict anyone. It simply tells you whether the same pattern reappears in a vehicle or along a probable transport path. Neighbors are canvassed for cameras. In 2021, porch systems and dashboard cams are often more reliable than memory. Detectives ask for absolute timestamps and the device's time offset so frames can be reconciled to dispatch logs. They request raw files, not screen recordings, to keep metadata intact. Even if a lens doesn't face the door, reflections, glass, car panels, appliance finishes can yield silhouettes or time-synced motion. Any retrieved clip is logged preliminary until a forensic video specialist validates time and continuity. Vehicle checks are methodical too. If a car linked to the residence is available under warrant, technicians start on the exterior for transfer trace, then move to handles, steering wheel, seatbelt latches, and trunk seams. They vacuum with filtered collection devices so they can separate fibers from particulates at the lab. They look for cleaning signatures, uniform streaking, product residues, but don't speculate in the field notes. What matters is whether the chemistry later identifies a cleaner, not a hunch about shine. Inside the house, the approach is steady. Technicians photograph room by room in wide, mid, and close frames. They shoot placards before lifting anything so the courtroom can follow sequence without guessing. If a stain or disruption area is identified, they apply presumptive tests only when necessary. In many jurisdictions, especially with known DNA indicating a violent act, labs prefer to route swabs directly to DNA analysis to avoid consuming material with color tests. Again, working versus. Confirmed stays disciplined in the language. Detectives also request context items that juries often overlook. Utility records and thermostat data. A sudden drop to an unusual temperature after the last known contact can help bound time windows or explain preservation artifacts. Likewise, recent trash pickup records are pulled and the container area is photographed. Small details, what day bins were emptied, whether the lid shows fresh swipe marks, won't headline a case, but they establish whether an opportunity existed to remove evidence before police control. All of this builds a chain the defense will test. Who took which swab, which seal numbers were used, which analyst opened which envelope. The Fresno team's paperwork reflects a basic truth of U.S. homicide work. If you can't defend the process, you can't defend the result. That's why a seemingly routine living room gets treated like a lab bench. It's less about what's dramatic and more about what survives cross-examination. A human reality sits under the procedure. Friends expected texts, pickups, vendor plans, the ordinary river of a weeknight. The silence that flagged risk now forces everyone to slow down and do the careful work. In towns like Fresno, murders aren't just crimes. They interrupt the rhythm of families and markets and small community events. Good processing respects that because the only meaningful answer the system can offer is proof that holds. By the end of this phase, the residence yields 3 categories: physical trace preserved and logged, latent and footwear impressions captured, and digital camera pulls routed for forensic validation. None of it names a culprit by itself. Together, it creates a map that the next chapter will test against phone records, carrier data, and surveillance timing. From the moment the residence is sealed, analysts turn to the streams that don't forget: carriers, cameras, and ledgers. The goal is linear. Fix Missy Hernandez's last verified window in Fresno and test every claimed movement against sources that run on clocks, not memory. In 2021, that means call detail records, tower sectoring, available CCTV, and targeted pulls of card and bank activity. It's the quiet work that often decides a crime story long before a courtroom does. The starting anchor is clean. Missy is seen leaving a downtown art event the night of December 7th. Within minutes to hours, her routine digital footprint goes dark. That silence is logged once in the file as a negative indicator of voluntary travel, then set aside so it doesn't become padding. Investigators request carrier records for devices tied to the residence and to known associates, focusing on time-adjacent calls, texts, and tower connections that can create a corridor rather than a dot. With modern networks, you rarely get a GPS breadcrumb that's courtroom safe. What you do get is sector and timing, and when paired with roads and cameras, it can be persuasive. CCTV work begins in concentric rings. Detectives ask the downtown venue for raw exports with device time and offset, then expand to adjacent storefronts, traffic cameras where available, and parking structures that retain video long enough to matter. The ask is specific. Absolute timestamps, no edited clips, original metadata preserved. A video tech maps the offsets to dispatch and carrier times so one timeline governs all sources. If a lens doesn't face a door, they still check reflective surfaces for silhouettes and vehicle movement. Even a few frames can corroborate or curb an alibi. As corridor candidates emerge, the map gets bigger. According to contemporaneous media and agency updates, digital evidence pointed teams toward inter-county routes including the I-5 Grapevine area, Highway 198, and segments of the California Aqueduct. That does not mean a single ping proved a route. It means overlapping stamps justified putting search teams and dive resources where the probability curve was rising. Analysts produce a narrow set of windows when a vehicle could have traveled those stretches without contradicting phone activity logs, camera times, or normal traffic patterns. The rule is simple. If two independent clocks disagree, the corridor dies. Financial pulls run in parallel. Subpoenas cover bank, credit, and common retail loyalty accounts connected to Missy and to the man contacted during the welfare check. The task isn't to imagine purchases, but to test for movement. Fuel buys on corridors, convenience stores near freeway ramps, and ATM uses that would place a card far from the residence during the critical window. Where receipts exist, investigators match register time to the device clock and request the exact aisle camera or cashier lane if policy allows. When nothing appears, that absence is recorded and then cleared from further narration so the file doesn't drown in no hits. License plate technology is approached carefully and with documentation. If a participating jurisdiction has automated readers along the corridors, hits are reviewed for plate confidence, time accuracy, and camera health at the moment of capture. Every LPR hit that survives validation is treated as preliminary until a human reviews the frame and the time base. A single missynced camera can ruin weeks of work. The same standard applies to private systems and business parks along the route. Raw files are nothing. Back on the Fresno grid, detectives chart a clean departure window from the art venue and compare it against neighbor cameras near the residence. The objective isn't to relive events already logged, it's to confirm sequence. If a vehicle associated with the residence appears in a neighbor's camera within a particular minute span, that span becomes the bookend for tower sectors that follow. If the vehicle never appears, analysts mark that gap and adjust hypotheses. The strength of this approach is that it cares more about internal agreement than about drama. Human statements are folded in only when there's a clock to weigh them against. Friends' accounts about last contact times are recorded and then pinned to the venue's video and the carrier timeline. If a claimed errand or late-night trip surfaces, card data and cameras are checked to either support it or set it aside. When answers line up too neatly, an investigator's note often reads, "The data align too cleanly. Double-check the offsets." That skepticism protects the file from confirmation bias. At each step, the paperwork is as important as the pixels. Requests are logged by date and recipient. Exports are hashed upon intake. Every analyst who touches the data adds a signature line. Defense teams will ask who normalized time, who changed a file name, and whether any clip was trimmed. The Fresno team's posture is consistent with best practice. Keep originals pristine, work on validated copies, and archive version histories so the same timeline can be reproduced months later. As January advances, the corridor list shrinks to what the combined record can actually defend. Search leaders are briefed with narrow windows, not hunches, so ground teams don't burn credibility chasing noise. The effort is methodical, sometimes slow, and exactly what families deserve. You don't fill airtime, you fill gaps with sources that agree. This chapter adds one discrete piece to the larger picture, a reconciled digital and financial map that explains why resources were placed where they were and when they were. It does not declare motive, and it doesn't need to. It shows movement supported by clocks, distances that make sense, and a process that respects scrutiny. In the end, that is what holds. The next step is simple on paper. Take every word that people offered and test it against clocks. According to police reports and contemporaneous media, Detectives begin with those who saw Missy Hernandez at the downtown Fresno art event on December 7, 2021. Friends describe her as punctual, responsive, and careful about confirming pickup plans. Within minutes to hours after she left the venue, that pattern stopped. That single break in routine is already logged elsewhere as negative evidence, so here it functions only as a control against which statements are measured. The man contacted during the welfare check is interviewed with counsel available. The arrest that night is for an October 2021 domestic violence matter involving Missy, not a fresh confession. Investigators document his timeline in straight lines: when he says he last saw her, where he says he went, and what he claims he did on the hours that followed. The standard questions are asked: phone use, vehicle use, fuel, food stops, sleep. None of those answers stand alone. Each is pinned to carrier records, neighborhood cameras, and any card activity that either supports or contradicts the account. Friends and neighbors are handled with the same discipline. A friend who expected a message about vending dates gives a time window for when she checked her phone. That statement is cross-checked with the venue's closing routine and nearby camera offsets. A neighbor who thinks a car arrived late is asked for the device that recorded the video and whether its clock was ever adjusted. Detectives request the raw file to preserve metadata. When recollections drift, they are not treated as lies. They are weighted lower than sources that run on validated time. Two safeguards appear again and again in the paperwork. First, time normalization. A single master timeline is created by aligning dispatch logs, camera offsets, and carrier time so that a minute on one system equals a minute on all others. Second, language discipline. Notes do not label contradictions as deception. They mark them as testable inconsistencies pending further corroboration. If an interviewee places themselves on a freeway segment at an hour when validated cameras show no matching vehicle and card records show no fuel in the corridor, the inconsistency is logged and retested before any conclusion appears in a charging document. Where interviews do help, it is usually by ruling out noise. An employer verifies that a potential witness clocked in early the next morning, shrinking the universe of people who could have seen Missy after the venue. A family contact confirms a habit. Missy rarely missed scheduled meetups without texting, then steps back while the file treats that habit as context, not proof. It is careful work, and it respects the people who are trying to help. As January advances, the interview tree narrows. Statements that cannot survive contact with cameras and carrier sectors fall away. Statements that do align are retained, not because they prove motive, but because they create a clean corridor of movement that can be presented to a jury without apology. One investigator's margin note captures the posture: when data and words agree, we keep both. When they don't, we keep the data. In a community case like this, there's also a human reminder. People wanted to talk because they wanted Missy found and the truth told. Good interviewing honors that by being accurate first and fast second. The goal is not to win an interview, it's to produce a record that still reads the same many months later. With the digital map narrowed, prosecutors move from possibility to proof. Charging in a homicide is about what can be defended under oath. In Fresno County, the district attorney files a murder count under California law after investigators present three pillars that work together. 1. Forensic findings at the residence described by officials as DNA indicating a violent act. 2. A reconciled movement record from carriers and cameras that supports inter-county travel within the critical window. And 3. Statements that, when pinned to clocks, leave testable gaps. None of these pieces alone defines a crime. Together, they justify the warrant stack that follows and a charging posture the state is willing to stand behind. Warrants arrive in sequence, not in a flood. Judges sign off on searches for the residence, associated vehicles, and specified devices and accounts. Carrier orders cover call detail and sector data. Financial orders target narrow periods tied to the movement corridor. Video requests demand original exports with device offsets preserved. Each order becomes its own exhibit, because admissibility later will depend on how cleanly these records were obtained and logged. The prosecution team understands that defense counsel will challenge scope, so the language in each warrant is tight, the time ranges are justified, and minimization is documented where non-pertinent data must be filtered out. Interagency coordination intensifies once those orders are active. The sheriff's detectives lead evidence collection. The district attorney's investigators handle witness logistics and discovery control. Regional partners assist where the corridor crosses jurisdictions, from traffic infrastructure access to specialized underwater operations. Search leaders receive briefings built on a single master timeline so that flight, ground, and dive assets deploy within windows the data actually supports. That approach protects credibility. It also keeps the file coherent months later when a jury sees how resources were placed and why. Prosecutors frame the theory of the crime around opportunity, capability, and corroboration rather than motive performance. Opportunity is anchored by the last seen event in downtown Fresno and a silent digital footprint within minutes to hours. Capability is addressed through access to the residence and a vehicle consistent with corridor travel. Corroboration comes from the lab, profiles and mixtures at the home that align with the narrative of a violent act there, with chain of custody intact from collection through analysis. The point isn't to dramatize, it's to show a sequence that leaves as little room for alternative explanations as the evidence allows. Risk management is built in. Prosecutors avoid overcharging. They file the murder count they can explain in plain language. They do not preview cause or mechanism unless the coroner's reporting and court rules permit it. They keep prior incidents in their proper lane. A documented domestic violence case from October 2021 is not treated as proof of homicide, but its existence can become relevant for context or pattern if a judge admits it under the rules of evidence. When the state says overwhelming, the file has to show why. Clean warrants, clean custody, clean correlations. The communication to the public remains measured. Investigators remind everyone that the defendant is presumed innocent and that details will be tested in court. Families are briefed privately with what can be shared without harming proceedings. It's a balance between transparency and protecting the integrity of the record. In a community case, that restraint is part of the work. By the time the charging documents are filed, the case is trial-shaped. A home treated as the primary scene, a movement corridor that explains resource placement, and a documentary chain that can be walked through in front of jurors without losing the thread. Prosecutors prefer evidence that teaches the jury without a narrator. This file is built to do that. Next, the focus shifts to what the jury will actually hear: admissibility, motions, and the boundaries of proof. With charges filed and discovery in motion, the fight shifts from the street to the rules of evidence. Prosecutors start with what jurors can legally hear. They notice motions to admit carrier records, location sector data, and synchronize camera pulls as authenticated business records with matching custodian declarations. The goal is simple: show Missy Hernandez's last known movements, the silence that followed within minutes, and a corridor consistent with later recovery. Without argument, just records. Defense replies that timestamps, device offsets, and export methods must be proven with a live foundation, not just certificates. The judge schedules brief evidentiary hearings to pin down accuracy and chain. At the same time, the state seeks to present prior domestic violence history for context. Under California Evidence Code, prosecutors argue the earlier October 2021 incident is relevant to explain escalation and intent, while defense pushes to exclude it as unfairly prejudicial. The court signals a narrow middle ground. If the state can tie the earlier incident to specific logistics, access to the home, control dynamics, documented injuries, limited testimony may come in with a careful instruction. The case remains about proof, not character. Digital extraction is the next battleground. Investigators describe read-only imaging of phones and selected accounts, hash values recorded, and targeted exports confined to the dates surrounding December 2021. Defense probes scope: how much non-case data was viewed, what minimization was used, whether a second examiner reproduced the results. The judge wants a clean audit trail: warrant dates and times aligned to extraction logs, any device time drift disclosed, and examiner notes preserved. The more precise the map, the harder it is to challenge. For the residents, the prosecution offers laboratory reports and chain of custody logs to establish that biological material collected inside the home matches Missy. They avoid adjectives and focus on process: collection date, packaging, seals, storage, analyst credentials, and statistics. Defense asks for a 402 hearing to test contamination controls and to cross on any secondary transfer theories. The court orders a clear foundation: who collected, when, how it was sealed, and where it went next. Jurors won't see the lab data until those boxes are checked. Statements become a narrow lane. If the defendant made any remarks during detention or transport, admissibility turns on Miranda and voluntariness. The state limits its ask to properly Mirandized exchanges or spontaneous statements. Defense moves to suppress anything arguably custodial without warnings. The court reviews reports line by line, trimming where necessary, because a small evidentiary error in a homicide trial can become a large appeal. Bail is unchanged. Given the homicide charge and the earlier domestic violence history, the court keeps the defendant in custody pending trial. Scheduling follows. A final readiness conference, jury selection date, and time estimates for the lab and digital experts. The judge instructs counsel to exchange exhibit lists with Bates numbers and to resolve foundation objections outside the jury's presence. What jurors deserve, the court reminds both sides, is a record that is reliable and legible. None of this is theater. It's maintenance, ensuring this crime is judged on admissible facts, not speculation. In towns like Fresno, confidence in verdicts is built here, in the quiet hearings where logs, signatures, and timestamps either hold or don't. Next comes the courtroom itself, what the jury hears, which experts take the stand, and how the timeline is told at trial. From motions argued in chambers, we move to what a jury would actually hear. The court starts by deciding which records can speak without commentary. Carriers authenticate call detail and sector connections. Video custodians identify original exports and offsets. Dispatch logs are matched to those same clocks so that a minute of time means the same thing across systems. The judge allows these materials as business records with live foundation. No flourish, no narrative, just the artifacts that mark where people were and when. That restraint matters in a crime this serious. It prevents speculation from smudging the edges of proof. Limited prior acts evidence is admitted with guardrails. The earlier domestic violence incident from October 2021 is permitted for context about access and escalation, but only through tightly framed testimony and a caution that the defendant is judged for the charged conduct, not for character. Jurors will hear why officers returned to the same residence in December and how risk was evaluated, but they are told plainly what that history can and cannot prove. For the residents, the lab's work is staged the way a jury can follow. Collection is established first: who bagged, sealed, and logged exhibits, where those items were stored, which analysts received them and when. The lab then describes comparisons consistent with Missy Hernandez being the source of biological material recovered inside the home, language kept technical and statistical rather than emotional. Defense cross-examines on contamination controls, secondary transfer, and lab reproducibility. The court requires precise answers: lot numbers, controls, analyst credentials, and audit history. Jurors are not asked to guess, they are asked to weigh process. Digital evidence is treated the same way. An examiner explains how device images were made read-only, how hash values were recorded, and how targeted exports were limited to the December 2021 window. A second examiner verifies the results. Camera exports from downtown and the neighborhood are shown with timestamps aligned to dispatch and carrier time. The point is not to dramatize a route, but to show a corridor that survives independent clocks. When defense presses on offset drift or camera health, the state brings in the technicians who documented those issues before trial. If a clip's time base cannot be validated, it is not played. Search and recovery testimony is narrow by design. Divers identify the segment of the California aqueduct near Huron where a recovery occurred and how chain of custody began at the water's edge. They do not narrate discovery at length. They account for the itemized custody that followed. The jury's map, already built from carriers and cameras, now has a lawful reason for why search resources were placed there at specific hours. Statements and interviews follow a similar rule. Witnesses who saw Missy at the downtown Fresno art event on the night of December 7th testify to times and routine, not to conjecture. Detectives describe how each account was pinned to the master time base. Where stories and clocks diverged, the divergence was recorded. Where they aligned, the alignment remained. If any defendant statements are offered, they come in only after the court is satisfied on warnings and voluntariness. The judge trims anything that risks confusing custody or coercion. Jury instructions emphasize what this record is and is not. Circumstantial evidence can prove facts when the circumstances form a consistent whole. Forensic and digital materials are weighed as the jurors find them to be reliable. Sympathy is not a tool. Timelines are. In closing, the prosecution promises a sequence that leaves little room for a benign explanation. A last-seen event in downtown Fresno, a residence supported by forensic findings indicating a violent act, a corridor of movement defended by clocks, and a recovery that explains the search footprint. The defense replies that timestamps can misalign, laboratories can err, and assumptions can overfit. The jurors are told to decide only on evidence admitted in this courtroom. Outside the courtroom, families and friends sit with a different timeline, the slow passage of hearings and continuances. Community grief is real, and so is the need for accuracy. Domestic violence cases teach the same lesson again and again. Patterns noticed early and reported early can change outcomes. If you or someone you know is in danger, speak to an advocate or law enforcement. Help is a phone call away. The clean file you've heard about exists because people came forward, records were preserved, and agencies did the maintenance work that justice requires. As of today, public dockets and reporting do not show a final verdict or sentence. That means presumption of innocence holds, and it means the system's next steps, motions, dates, trial, remain active responsibilities for court and counsel. We end where accountability belongs, on the evidence, under oath, in one venue. Telling Missy Hernandez's story is more than recounting a crime. It's a reminder that safety, respect, and vigilance matter in every community. Looking back, I see how small warning signs, if addressed early, might have changed her path. For me, the lesson is clear. Speak up, protect each other, and never dismiss patterns of harm. What do you think this case teaches us about responsibility, in families, in neighborhoods, in justice? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if this story resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel so we can keep sharing these real stories that matter.